colonization of Africa developed rapidly in the scramble for Africa, which was the colonization and annexation of territory during the period of new imperialism in late 19th and early 20th centuries. It is widely believed that Africa had up to 10,000 different states and autonomous groups that governed Africa. They were very different with distinct languages and customs before it was colonized. European colonization of Africa made big changes in the tribes. Due to the effect of the political system during imperialism, they were put together. This caused many social and political problems that started war between them. For a long time, most African states were able to maintain their independence. However, in 1874, Great Britain annexed the West Coastal States as the first British colony of Gold Coast. By 1900s, France had added the huge area of French West Africa to its colonial empire. This left France in control of the largest part of West Africa. However, Germany controlled Congo, Cameroon, German Southwest Africa, and German East Africa. Meanwhile, the Europeans took advantage of the ignorant Africans. Lobenguela, a southern African king, was asked by a European group of people for a place to dig for gold, and said they would give him back certain things for the right to do so. A written document was presented for him to sign. However, he asked them what it contained, and in it were his words, they say. Lobenguela signed the document, and after 3 months he heard from other sources that he had given by the document the right to all the minerals of his country. During the first quarter of the 20th century, resettlement turned to action. Across Africa, native people began to organize political parties and movements seeking for the end of foreign rule. They wanted to be independent and self-governing.
In Africa happens two imperialism, the old one and the new one. The old imperialism happened between the 1500s and 1900s, in which the Europeans established colonies in Africa's coastal regions. In contrast, the new one occurred between 1870 and 1914. The nationalism had produced a strong centrally governed nation-states. The Industrial Revolution had made economies stronger as well. During this time, Europeans, industrialized nations became more aggressive into expanding into other lands. The new imperialism was focused mainly in Africa, where declining empires and local wars left many states vulnerable. In Africa, many states had been weakened by the slave trade. Some causes of the new imperialism in the economy was the need for natural resources, especially those of West Africa, that include peanuts, timber, hides, and palm oil. In addition, some causes were the looking for new weapons, new medicines, improved ships, need for new markets, a place for growing population to settle, and a place to invest profits. The growing European presence in West Africa led to increasing tensions with African governments in the region. Also, they include causes about the politics and the militaries that are bases for trade and navy ships, power and security for global empire, and spirit of nationalism. Some causes that the imperialism include about the society are wish to spread Christianity civilization and belief that Western culture is best. The imperialists were attracted to these resources because Africa was the last continent that remained relatively unexploited.
Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Italy, Portugal, and Spain were competing for power within European power politics. One way to demonstrate national prominence was through the acquisition of territories around the world, including Africa. The third major element was the social factor. As a result of industrialization, new and major social problems grew in Europe: unemployment, poverty, homelessness, social displacement of rural areas, and so on. These social problems developed partly because not all people could be absorbed by the new capitalist industries. One way to resolve this problem was to acquire colonies and export this population. This led to the establishment of settler colonies in Central Africa areas like Zimbabwe and Zambia. Eventually, the overriding economic factors led to the colonization of the other parts of Africa. Thus, it was the interplay of these economic, political, and social factors and forces that led to the scramble for Africa and the frenzied attempts by European commercial, military, and political agents to declare and establish a stake in different parts of the continent through inter-partialist commercial competition, the declaration of exclusive claims to particular territories for trade, the imposition of traffic against other European traders, and claims to exclusive control of waterways and commercial routes in different parts of Africa. The scramble was so intense that there was fear that it could lead to interpartial conflicts and even wars. To prevent this, the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck convened a diplomatic summit of European powers in the late 19th century. This was the famous Berlin West African Conference, most generally known as the Berlin Conference, held from November 1884 to February 1885. The conference produced a treaty known as the Berlin Act, with provisions to guide conduct of European interpersonal competition in Africa.
Slavery in Africa. By the 1700s, most slaves were transported from Africa across the Atlantic in British ships. Denmark also made illegal slave trading in 1808. United States joined the cause forbidding its citizens to participate in this trading of slaves. Earlier in the 19th century, Europeans had profited from the slave trade in this region of Africa. By the late 1800s, however, trade enslaved people had virtually ended. As the slave trade declined, Europe's interests in other forms of trade increased. The majority of the slaves that were traded in changed resources from Africa to British, Denmark, and USA. The slaves worked in extreme conditions and with very, very low payments and no benefits for them or their family. Until the early 1990s, most Africa was still dominated by dictatorships. There were a lot of inequalities and injustice to the Africans. Changes in democracy started because both military and civilian governments had failed to alleviate poverty, unemployment, and oppression, and had not provided their citizens what they needed and asked for. The African opposition was encouraged by many social movements in Europe, such as the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, etc. This influenced the Africans to, in a certain way, rebel against their government, and yet they got their democracy. Western culture continued to influence much of the world. Transportation, education, and medical care were improved. Resistance to imperial rule evolved into nationalist movements, and many economies became dependent on single cash crops grown for export.
What is the most important fact about the process of democracy development in Africa?
It has been a struggle for the Africans. Due to imperialism, they did suffer a huge effect on their political situation. At first, they had small tribes, and overall, the power was distributed into small groups. So, when the Europeans came to Africa, they started to conquer so much territory and integrate societies that are not supposed to be meant to be living together. So, we talk about the Tutsis or the Hutus that they ideologically and racially are enemies. So you put them together in the same country is going to create conflict. So when the African government starts to arise and European imperialism starts to diminish, the African countries are left with a country in economic poverty. They have no way how to govern themselves, and they find this structure really hard for them to actually get to organize themselves. So corruption has really affected them, and even though they try to maintain democracy, I don't think that many have been able to do that because the corruption in their system is so much into it that it has been really hard. So that's why you get to see warlords or groups that control everything and leave the rest of the people in poverty.
Why were European countries interested in West Africa and North Africa?
mainly because of the resources. These areas were and still pretty much rich in natural resources, which could be extracted by the Europeans, not to say at a very cheap cost, but in a very easy way.
What was an effect of imperialism by European countries and the reaction of the society?
There are going to be two types of effect of imperialism. The effect for the European nations, it's going to be measured in terms of economic and political power. It kind of aroused a race between them to see who would have more presence in Africa or in the world mostly, and who will get more resources. The effects that this is going to cause for the African society, but immediately during the 19th century are not going to be that measured. But we're going to start to see, especially during the decolonization process of the mid 20th century, it's when we're going to see the real side effects and the reaction of society.